Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to another video here on Star Wars Lads. Today we are doing our monthly tier list, which you all voted on, and you voted for Legends versus Canon. So this is going to be a pretty different tier list than we've ever done, and in a different style format than you're used to. We'll explain that now, but before we do so, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel. We're trying to get to 1,500 subs here pretty soon, so if you can subscribe, that'll really help us out. We're also aiming for 40 likes here on this video, so if you can help us hit that like target, that'll really help us out as well with the YouTube algorithm. Comment below, let us know what you think of our opinions. So let's get into the video here. I'll bring in the tier list right now. And we've got 4 different tiers here. There's an empty row, as you can see, that doesn't really have anything to do with anything. It's just a divider between the two. The way we're going to rank these are the better version with the Legends tier. So if we think a Legends version is better than a Canon version, we're going to put it up here. If we think a Canon version is better than Legends, we're putting it up here. It does not mean that like Legends is higher than Canon. Just put it there because they're older than Canon. And the same thing down here, the lesser version of Canon, lesser version of Legends. And then within the tiers themselves, we'll kind of rank the characters. We'll start off here with 4LOM. 4LOM has not really been in too much Canon or Legends material, but he has been around in both for a while. He has an extensive backstory in Legends, which definitely is a plus. He appears in Shadows of the Empire, as well as the Bounty Hunter Wars, the Underworld Yavin Basilica. I think he's gotten a bit more characterization in canon in Bounty Hunters and War of the Bounty Hunters. I wanted to say Bounty Hunter Wars, but I think his backstory and a bit more of the stuff they've given to him in Legends would probably put the Legends version up at the top for me.
Yeah, I do have to agree with that. I think what we've seen in War of the Bounty Hunters and what we've seen so far in the Bounty Hunters mainline, it's been pretty good for me. I think he doesn't really have the same charm or appeal as Zuckuss does at this point. However, I will say there is potential. Next up is Admiral Ackbar from Legends versus Admiral Ackbar in Canon. This was a little bit more of a toss up for me because when we look at Legends, I think a lot of the best stuff from him is really the New Republic era. He is a little bit more of like a politician, a little bit more of a diplomat. He does make some mistakes like demilitarizing some of his craft before the Thrawn, but he has a little bit more of like a ending to me in Legends because he just dies at some point in the Yuuzhan Vong War. And in canon, yeah, he was a big military commander already, and he does, just like in Legends, become a slave to Tarkin. That hasn't been filled out. Obviously, his death is a little bit of a stinger, but I think it still is a little bit more appealing than just saying he kind of died off screen. I would go with better version canon here.
I'm going to go with better version Legends here, personally. For me, I think reading the Thrawn trilogy and reading X-Wing especially, he's just a very big character, a lot bigger than he is in canon, personally, for me. And I think the sequel trilogy, his death in The Last Jedi, has always rubbed me a little bit of the wrong way. I do like the way he's more interested in politics. See that contrast that we see so much in real life between military and politicians, and we see the battles that he has to fight with that. I do appreciate that he's at least a bit more part of the establishment of the New Republic and a bit more of a perpetual piece of the New Republic in Legends than he is in canon, where he's basically forced out in canon. For me personally, I would go with Legends.
I think for me, it's just sometimes we do have to acknowledge the bias of like how a live action representation does color how you look at these characters. And even if it is a bit of a sting, we got to see him on the big screen again twice. So I did appreciate that. But I do agree there's a lot more of Admiral Akbar, even if it's not necessarily original trilogy, everything afterwards, there's a lot more of. But, I'm fine with that. I'll give it to you for having a better Legends version.
Next, we have one that I think is going to be pretty easy for us to decide: Ahsoka Tano. Ahsoka Tano's extensive material in canon that's not in Legends features obviously Rebels as well as The Mandalorian, the Ahsoka book, Tales of the Jedi. We have so much material for her in canon. Legends, she's featured in a lot of comic books and some novels as well that are not considered canon. But I think for this, it's obviously going to be the canon version is better.
All the way canon. Even her appearances in those books are like very small. And we have a whole show of her. And then Mandalorian, she's the first main character at least to jump from animation into live action. And now she's getting her own show. So her effect on Star Wars is incredible, but it's mostly been one on canon. Next up is probably the biggest man in Star Wars, and that's Anakin Skywalker. This is a toss up for me because I think there's some really cool things with like younger Anakin in Legends. Not the biggest fan of Jedi Quest, but I do like having a little bit more of his mindset and what's going on there. Canon, it is always what matters more to me, and what matters more to me is that we get to see some really strong storytelling, and something like Brotherhood is just it filled in that bridge that I really needed between the end of episode 2 and the start of the Clone Wars for me. Even if there's I need a little bit more there. So I have to go with canon there.
This is really tough. And again, we also separated Vader and Anakin here as two entries. So we're not going to be talking about Vader's storyline here, but Anakin in canon, just the season 7 of Clone Wars arc might take that over the top for me. I think even the goodbye with Ahsoka, the way Clone Wars ends for Anakin is a lot more heartbreaking and bittersweet than it does in the '03 version. Anakin there is very distant and dark. He's much more like he is in Attack of the Clones than he is in Revenge of the Sith or in the Clone Wars 2008 show. I think because I'm more attached to the Anakin from canon, the Clone Wars version at the end, and then the way we transition him in Brotherhood, I think I have to give it to Anakin in canon as well. So next we have Bail Organa. Bail Organa, I think, is another pretty obvious one. Bail Organa in canon, the things that have been different than Legends, obviously we have Rogue One, we have his appearance in Leia, Prince of Alderaan, and then most recently we have him in Obi-Wan Kenobi, we've had him in Tales of the Jedi, Ahsoka. There's been so many things, and this character's been brought a lot more to the forefront in canon. I think with Jimmy Smits being more willing to come back and reprise the role of this character, we've gotten to see so much of his return and the rise of the prequels in canon. We do have some cool stories with him in Legends, specifically like The Force Unleashed is one that I always remember his impact in that. But I think I have to go with the canon version of Bail Organa here.
Yeah, I have to also agree. Canon for me. The Force Unleashed kind of jumps the gun a little bit by bringing him literally to the Death Star, almost killing him and a bunch of other senators who are part of like the whole like behind the double agent work of Star Killer to create this rebellion and whatnot. There is the stuff with like the Queen's trilogy that he becomes a good friend of Padme and his development there, and his awareness and his knowledge is I think something that people don't really convey too much. He does a lot of political things, but he's also extremely smart. And like you said, live action, Jimmy Smith's coming back for Kenobi, coming back for Rogue One, and now hopefully we'll see him in Andor season 2. So I think no matter what, we'll see an evolution of the character into some very serious political stuff that will be hopefully great, like a lot of season 1 was. Our next character, and that's Boba Fett. Canon, we've gotten another live action portrayal out of him. We've got to literally see him escape from the Sarlacc pit, which is wonderful, but it is definitely much more of a mixed bag of a show than a lot of us are expecting. He is going through a little bit of an identity crisis throughout that show. I like War of the Bounty Hunters quite a bit. I like a lot of showing off some of his skills there. But Legends is Legends. He's populated that way more. He becomes Mandalore. He even works with Jaina Soul to teach her some skills. He's there into the Second Galactic Civil War. The whole issues of like how the cloning is deteriorating his body. Like those are some really cool concepts and topics. So I'd have to give it to Legends.
I would agree with you. I think the Book of Boba Fett, I wouldn't want to say has lessened my appeal towards Boba in canon, but I think giving him more backstory, giving him more character, and also giving him kind of an unappealing type show has made it a little less exciting for the character for me in canon. Like that mystery that used to be behind the canon version has been pulled back and it's not as strong as we had hoped. Where the Legends version, he's every bit the badass you always expected. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been so hard for the canon version to live up to that. He's also like the Mandalorian in Legends versus canon. He is kind of losing that title to Din a bit. Din is kind of becoming the most iconic Mandalorian, the one everybody knows and is talking about. For that reason, I would definitely put him at the top of our Legends tier. Next, we have Bossk. Bossk is also a tougher one. We have a lot more backstory again, like for LOM, for him in Legends, but he has been a consistent part of canon, whether it has been the Bounty Hunter comics, which he's been in from the start. He's a big name in Legends for sure, and he does have a big role, Shadows of the Empire, Bounty Hunter Wars, stuff like that. I think I would lean towards the canon version of Bossk, though, for me.
I too want to say the canon version of Bossk. He is like one of those characters that he is more style over substance, but in Legends, he doesn't really have much going on. I mean, he does also die well, not die. He retires pretty quickly. Versus here in the Bounty Hunters line, I do like a lot of his humor. I do like a lot of the stuff in the Clone Wars with him. I'd have to give him canon as well. Okay, so next we have Commander Cody from Legends or Canon. When it comes to Legends, I think he is still pretty interesting of a character. He still is very loyal, but he kind of hates all these human conscripts. In a way, his story in Legends is kind of being filled up by Crosshair and the Bad Batch of being that Imperial perspective of like sticking with something that isn't the best for you. Immediately, the idea of Cody having left the Empire, gone AWOL, and I love this redemption so far that we've gone. So canon for me.
I agree. I would put Cody in the canon top tier as well. I think Cody is a character that we are going to see plenty more of from the Bad Batch appearance already. It seems like we're going to get a stronger characterization for this character, at least, and a lot of the things we share between canon and Legends already. So I would go with Cody here, with also the assumption that he will be a huge part of the Bad Batch moving forward. So now we have Dengar. Dengar is a character that for sure has gotten some of the most development in canon. He is a character that's been used over and over again, and used both as like a comedic buffoon, but also a solid bounty hunter. I like the version we've gotten in canon, and we've gotten his progression throughout a variety of things. We obviously are getting him right now in Bounty Hunters, and we've gotten him in the Star Wars series, War of the Bounty Hunters. We even got him in some of the other comics before the 2020 line. We also got him in Aftermath, which leads towards and hints towards the future for him as well. Dengar has also gotten quite a bit in Legends. He's been one of the more forefront bounty hunters there. I'd say I'd probably lean towards the canon version for Dengar.
Dengar is a little bit more of an interesting toss up for me because I agree. I do like a lot of his stuff that happens in canon, and he certainly has been more fleshed out in canon. The biggest issue for me in canon right now is the potential of him being the Rot Deng character that we see in the sequel trilogy. But you are right. I think Legends, his story is just a little too short. It's not really that defined. Preeminent, but again, one of those guys who's like style over substance versus where in canon they've even brought in his like old Legends love interest, so I do appreciate. Moving on, we have Depa Billaba from Legends versus Depa Billaba in canon. I really like a lot of her stuff in Legends. Shatterpoint, we just read that last month on their channel, and that was really one of the biggest insights to her character there. But then when we look at canon, we get to see some of like the cool things about like her being Kanan's master. I want to say Legends, but it's not by much.
I will agree with you. I think this is one of the first characters we've talked about here that has probably more material in canon, but a much stronger characterization in Legends. And I think Shatterpoint alone, the amount of depth and material we get with her and the connection between her and Mace, I think is more fleshed out and well-rounded than maybe the connection we'd get between her and Kanan. So next we have Count Dooku. Count Dooku is a character that would have been closer, but I think for me, I have to go canon here. Tales of the Jedi was so good, and then we also have Dooku Jedi Lost. We've gotten a lot more backstory for Dooku over the last 4 or 5 years in canon than we really ever did in Legends. And while we have some cool villain appearances for him in maybe Yoda Dark Rendezvous or Clone Wars 03, I think the strong characterization of him in Tales of the Jedi, his tragic fall, the way he's manipulated, and the way he grows into the separatist we see in the prequel trilogy, I've got to give it to the canon version.
I agree. I would go with canon. A big thing that I really do appreciate is that any appearance that he's had in canon has had some like real work done. Even like the Age of Republic one shot that he has. But Tales of the Jedi was incredible. That works so well with Dooku Jedi Lost. Our next character is Grievous. This one is also kind of a toss up like Depa. I think we've had way more canon stuff with Grievous. When we talk about his legend stuff, though, his backstory is way more interesting. The manipulation of Dooku, making it seem like the Jedi who are behind all the tragedy of the massacre of his people. He is a great warrior who looks up to the Jedi at one point and wants to be like them, but he just doesn't have the Force powers. Also, everything about Battle of Coruscant, his intro in 2003 Clone Wars, incredible stuff there. I think I have to give it to Legends Grievous.
I absolutely would give it to Legends Grievous. I think for me, this is one of the biggest landslides that we've talked about so far. Just his characterization in Clone Wars 03 is so much better to me than anything we've seen. And of course, his backstory is so much stronger. Clone Wars 2008 to 2013, season 1 through 6 are Legends as well. So we have both versions of him in Legends, but just because we have the scarier version and we get to see Battle of Coruscant and we get to see his first appearances, I love that version. So I would definitely give it to Legends. So now we have Han Solo. We're talking about the first one of our big three from the OT, and these are going to be controversial opinions no matter what we choose. Han has gotten more development. I think out of the three, Leia's probably gotten the most development in canon. Han's the second, and Luke's the third. His appearance in The Force Awakens, I absolutely love. I think Harrison Ford brought a lot more to that performance than I thought he was going to, and I think he did a great job. We also have some good stuff with Han, and obviously Solo, a Star Wars story. We've gotten comics with him. He's appeared in Aftermath. Still, though, I think the amount of stories he's in, the amount of great stories he's also in Legends, a more in-depth backstory, even if some things are convoluted, I'd probably give it to Legends Han.
This one is gonna be a difficult one because I'm gonna go with canon. I think in some ways there are some characters and some actors that you cannot separate. And like you said, I do like The Force Awakens. He does bring his A game. He is truly enjoying it. That dialogue that he has with Ben, Kylo Ren at this point is really good. Like that is one of the best acted scenes throughout the trilogy. Solo: A Star Wars Story feels more gimmicky as time goes on. It brings in a lot of things that were in different stories that just were part of a larger narrative that weren't like really the main points. I do a lot more about like the scrum rats and a lot of the things that happen on Corellia. I think Kira is a really interesting person in his life to be like his first like lost love mistake. I think is pretty cool. It's when we get closer to the New Hope timeline, I want to say everything canon wise feels better for me. Like the Yuzan Vong War and onwards, I don't know. I feel like he just becomes redundant. He's already kind of dragging around. He's always going to be Han. Doesn't really get much character development that I love. It's not by much, but I will give it to canon.
All right, so time for the debate, I guess. For me, I think the thing that pulls me towards Legends Han is there's just one point in his life that we really haven't discovered yet in canon, and that's the fall of Ben Solo. I want to see what turns him back into the smuggler, what forces him to leave his family, what causes the separation between Han and Leia, and what are the more personal moments between that. Because I think the post Return of the Jedi version of Han in Legends is a lot stronger. For me, I like that he is more of a family man. He's the reluctant family man where he's like, he loves and embraces who he is, but at the same time, he can't help but have those moments where he goes off on adventures and is swept away in being the old scoundrel Han, but he kind of puts this aside to be the New Republic hero Han. Of course, I agree. His story goes on for forever, and we have so many stories that it is kind of hard to compare the canon and Legends versions. But I do think the Han Solo trilogy before A New Hope, it's a very similar story to Solo Star Wars story, so I think it's a bit of a wash there, but it is a bit more in depth. I guess it spans more years as well. I'm okay giving you Han, but I personally do think the Legends version is much more fleshed out.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. A lot of it is leaning on the potential of what happens in those 30 years, and we don't really have much yet. I do like his involvement in, the liberation of Kashyyyk. I think that's a lot cooler than whatever we got in Legends. Probably the moments that I felt like he had like the most going on for him outside of his family life of being the reluctant father is when Chewbacca dies in Legends. There is like a really mourning, a changing, but then it just kind of disappears after you move it back 10, 15 years. It kind of reverts. And I also don't like some of the things that he has in his storylines. Like I don't really love like the Thrak and Sal Solo and all that stuff and his whole family lineage. I think the stuff with Corellia sometimes is good, sometimes gets a little too convoluted for me. I like that he is a nobody more in canon versus where Legends they started trying to make him into something a little bit more and more. So that's why I think you're right. There is way more depth overall, but I like Kira. I don't like some of the things that we have with his family in Corellia, and if he's the same guy as a 70-year-old, I do have some things there. I like the idea that canon has him revert. Ben's fault is a big reason for that, but I think there's also enough of his life that can be amplified to explain why he fully slips into those ways too. Next up, we have IG-88, the OG IG droid. Canon, he's just kind of been there. Probably one of the few bounty hunters from Empire Strikes Back that has had non-existent development in canon. In Legends, he uploads himself to the Death Star and takes over. And there's also this one shot in canon where he's like very despondent about like the actions he takes and all that. And I was like, oh wow, this is like this is an interesting life for a droid, and I like seeing how he was dealing with that. I think you have to give it to him in Legends.
Completely agree. The Legends version is a lot better. And even if the stories were pretty similar in the amount of stories we've gotten for both, I do think the legend and the lore behind IG-88 and Legends is a lot stronger. All right. So next we move on to Jabba the Hutt. This one is also pretty close for me. I think we've gotten a lot of Jabba the Hutt content in that gap between 5 and 6. Him in Bounty Hunters, we've gotten him in the War of the Bounty Hunters, but overall, he is a much bigger presence in Legends than I would say he is in canon before A New Hope as well. That like episode 3 to episode 4 gap, the Dark Times, Jabba's a lot more present there than he is in canon so far. I'd give it to the Legends version.
I would also give it to the Legends version. He is a character I'm way more familiar with in Legends than necessary canon. I'd love to see that fleshed out, especially if we get something to follow up Solo Star Wars story, or even just stuff to follow up Revenge of the Sith with him. I think Legends wins out here. I have the unfortunate pleasure of introducing our next character, and that is Jaxxon. I don't really have a say in any of this. I will give it to Legends just because he's infamous in Legends as just, being like almost like a Bugs Bunny, but worse.
Yeah, I'll agree. I kind of threw this one and the next one in for fun. Jaxxon is a much bigger character in Legends than he is in canon, so I would definitely give it to the Legends version. So the next one I also referenced here, we got Jocasta Nu. I think I've always thought it was kind of funny, but also very cool the way in the Revenge of the Sith video game, Anakin just grabs her and impales her immediately during the Order 66 fight scene in that game.
Yeah.
So that's actually the image here of her. In canon, we actually have a lot cooler death for her. She survived a little bit past Order 66, and she's kind of protecting the Jedi archives and the Jedi vaults from the shadows on Coruscant. Definitely going with the canon version, but I thought this was another funny one to add.
Canon version all the way. I think we also have to give some props to how you still keep the characterization of her being the librarian. She doesn't like to disrespect that like the Grand Inquisitor does when he throws around all these books and whatnot. Next up, we have Lando Calrissian. I don't know. He is a bit of a harder character for me to fully say that I like or dislike more so in Legends or like more so in canon. I do appreciate that in canon we get a lot more of his story as the older man to Han. I do like his characterization in Solo Star Wars Story. He's obnoxious, and I think Lando in some ways has to kind of perfect the Lando charm. He doesn't really have that as a 23 or 24-year-old or whatever. I think the history of him in Legends is certainly cooler, especially how he gets Cloud City. I think is certainly a lot cooler than having him be in canon on Lothal, taking care of like a bunch of pigs and whatnot. Also, his work in the New Republic stuff is a lot cooler so far. We don't really have Lando too much so in the canon New Republic era. I also do like his role in Shadows of the Empire. I think he's way cooler there so far. I do like a lot of what we're getting in the canon comics right now, but we are still working on him as part of an ensemble instead of like sometimes like a main character even. But he does have that. He falls into that little thing where he's a character that after a while you're like, what is he doing? He's just there. He kind of drags on. Oh, love interest. Oh, he got a new ship. Oh, okay. Whereas in canon, I really loved Shadows of the Sith, and I love his characterization. I love that he felt his age, his loss of his family, and all that. Truly, it is a toss-up for me. Just because I really love Shadows of the Sith, I will say canon, but I'm more than happy putting him in Legends too.
This was one of the hardest of the OT characters for me personally. I do like that he is around in the New Republic. He's like a hero of the New Republic in Legends as well. But I also like that he's got that kind of like his side gig. He goes on and he does like the mining on Niklon, and he's got all these different business operations going. He kind of returns more back to form as the Lando we know. Versus canon, he seems to stay with the New Republic for a little longer. Shadow of the Sith is the main thing that is like not making me say Legends immediately. I think it's a very measured version of Lando, and it's a version we don't get to see too much. And I think that's the one thing canon has done with him better than Legends is it's brought him a lot more emotion and character behind the scoundrel. Even something like Charles Soule's Lando book, we get to see that relationship between him and Lobot. Like he has actual relationships. It's not just like I'm using you as a pawn or I'm a scoundrel, a swindler, you can't trust me. It's he's got that in-depth relationship besides with Han or with our OT characters that I think is nice to flesh out. The fact that he has a daughter and is desperately searching for her because his life is falling apart before him. The Rise of Skywalker version of Lando is good. It's nothing that great or interesting. They could have done more with him there. I do really like Donald Glover's version in Solo Star Wars Story. Very torn, but I'm also leaning towards canon. I think some of the more recent material and the really getting under his skin in canon pushes him towards the top for me in that sense. But again, his Legends storylines are so much bigger, bolder. That's where I'm really torn here. But I think if I was to pick the version, I would also probably go canon. But now to move on to Leia. Leia is another really tough one. And Leia, outside of the 4 OT characters we're going to talk about here, the main 4, Leia goes on a very different arc in both canon and Legends. Legends, she becomes a politician, but she is a Jedi and a mother first and foremost. It's very prominent that she is like the Jedi savior, the one that in early Legends everybody wants to kidnap or take her kids or, use her and her powers and her kids' powers to fulfill some type of prophecy or destiny. Whereas in canon, she is more reserved. She's that politician. She's playing the games. She's more of a mental strategist. She has the Force, but she uses the Force to augment her abilities in the political realm rather than in a more literal sense. I do love that she is like a full, powerful Jedi in Legends, but now with the Rise of Skywalker, we have that hinted that she was a Jedi, and we might get to learn a bit more about her history of the Jedi as a Jedi here in the future in canon. I know nobody loves this scene except me, but she is powerful because she's able to pull herself back, survive in space, pull herself back in The Last Jedi. This one was close for me, but when I look at the OT characters, I have to go with canon version of Leia.
If I look at the grand overview of Leia, I want to say that Leia in 10 years is going to be superior to Legends. I think Leia, as she is right now in canon, is on equal footing. I think it's a give or go kind of a day for me. Like, do I like her in canon more in one day, or do I like her in Legends? Right now, my thinking is I actually kind of like her a little bit more in Legends. She is more actively a Jedi. I do like that she is quite literally like the head of state of the New Republic, and the New Republic under her is powerful. I do like the whole things with the 3 kids. Unfortunately, it does get repetitive that people are constantly trying to kidnap her kids, but I do like that she understands the risks of being like the next bearer of generation of Jedi, and she still is willing to do what it takes. Han is willing to do what it takes. I feel like that familial aspect of her isn't really in canon right now. I like everything set in the original trilogy with the comics and books and everything with her. I love little Leia in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. But right afterwards, right, like, I don't know, like you were saying, the hints at the Rise of Skywalker for being a Jedi. But how long is he a Jedi for, right? I know she claims to be a Jedi a lot in the New Republic era, but she's mostly just trained by Luke and then using her skills and lightsaber. But I really do love her sequel trilogy characterization. I really wish we got to see her as the main lead of Rise of Skywalker of the original trilogy characters, each getting their one film. I think her final act is really powerful in canon too. I want to say Legends, but I think I can be convinced for canon.
Leia's pre A New Hope storyline is I think way better in canon as well. And I kind of like her in the political sphere. It makes her a bit different from Luke, where Luke in a lot of Legends material, when we do Jedi stuff, it's Luke, but then Leia's there as like a secondary figure. And Leia and her kids are like, they have some of their own spin-off stories they have, but I feel like Leia is underserved a lot of times in Legends for Luke, where in canon, I like that she kind of has her own realm that she deals with. It's a pretty strong relationship between her and Ben. Obviously, she has a strong relationship with Jaina and Jason as well. So that's kind of a wash for me. But I think seeing it in live action played really strongly for me. Bloodline is one of my favorite books ever, and that's a canon novel. And the way she's not really a part of the system all the time in canon. She has to fight for what she believes in. She has to fight against the New Republic becoming complacent in canon versus in Legend. She's one of the leaders of the New Republic. She helps all of its problems and flaws. She's kind of a part of in Legends. So I'd still lean towards canon Leia.
Okay, yeah, no, I can agree. I mean, I do really appreciate Bloodline. Moving on, we got Lobot. I think canon, his appearances in the Lando miniseries and like explanation of why he can't talk, I think was tragic, but I really did appreciate like the sacrifice. He's not really a character that in Legends you really talk about him more than his appearance in episode 5. Yeah, I'll give it to canon.
I agree. I think this one's far and away canon. This one. So now we move on to Luke Skywalker. This is going to be the most controversial one, no matter what we choose. But for me, actually, out of all the original trilogy characters, this is the one that's the easiest for me to pick. I will pick the Legends version. I think Luke obviously has way more story in Legends than we've seen in canon. And really, these last 3 or 4 years have done a lot to elevate Luke in canon in my mind with Book of Boba Fett and then Mandalorian, as well as Shadow of the Sith. We're getting a lot more Luke story. Legends, he's the main character of pretty much every book of the 90s. He's the main character of the entire post Return of the Jedi storyline in Legends. I love what he's able to do. I think he's not as maybe complex as he will be when we flesh out more of his future here in canon. But as it sits now, the badass that he is in Legends, how powerful he is in Legends, and really the fact that he is a character that isn't that one dimensional. He still has a lot of doubts. He still has a lot of insecurities, and he still fails and messes up a lot, but he always is able to return back to that pedestal. I love what we get in Legends Luke.
Yeah, again, this is being filmed early 2023. Our perspectives of a lot of these characters, even some characters that we've followed for 30, 40 years, it's empty. Honestly, what do we know? We know that at some point he fights Snoke and disfigures his face, right? But he isn't aware that Snoke has been infiltrating his nephew's mind, and Snoke's mind has also been infiltrated by Palpatine's, and that's a whole dynamic and relationship that can shape a lot of the 30 years with these four stories that we just don't have here. And I love Luke in Shadow of the Sith because I think he is a great bridge between the version that we see in Legends, but there's also the balance of how he is literally coming in as the new and only Jedi master of an order that has everything wiped clear, right? Even if I find Luke to be annoying and his portrayal and everyone making him a superhero and learning all these different abilities, some that are contradictory, like the Force lightning and whatever, and that he does fall to the dark side in Dark Empire. I can live with that more right now than I can live with the Luke that we have so far. Every appearance of Luke so far in canon since 83 has been wonderful. It's just a matter of like, well, there's like 50 years of his life that we don't know anything about, and we need to really flesh that out. So in 2023, I still give it to Legends Luke. Next up, we have Darth Maul or Maul. I think canon blows out Legends by a mile. I know Legends still includes a lot of the stuff in the 2008 Clone Wars show, but everything after that, like after season 6, you don't get to see the Siege of Mandalore arc, him being revived as like a clone, and Vader stabbing himself to kill them all and say, "Who do I hate more than you? Myself." Like that stuff is really cool and all. I mean, Canon Mall I think is amazing. Rebels, we did some really cool things there. I like the idea of him, really leading the Mandalorians at some point, being the rightful victor, and if the Mandalorians themselves don't like that. We also have Crimson Dawn with him. That's a huge thing. So many cool nuggets that we've gotten, and whatever we've gotten fleshed out with him has been way better in canon for me.
I agree. Canon Maul all the way. Legends Maul, I think, is better pre Phantom Menace. We have a lot more backstory with Maul Shadowhunter, Maul Lockdown, and even Darth Plagueis. He's a big part of that. But Clone Wars, Siege of Mandalore arc is so important for Maul's story, and that's not a part of Legends. And also everything in Rebels, including his death, is those are not in Legends. So I think I easily have to give it to canon. Next is another one that I think is pretty one-sided. We have Mon Mothma. Mon Mothma has been one of the most developed characters in canon, surprisingly. Similar to Bail Organa, we explored this 5-year period before A New Hope so much that these two characters have been so instrumental into the formation of the rebellion in canon that we don't quite get to see in Legends. Now, on the flip side, we get way more of Mon Mothma post Return of the Jedi in Legends, which definitely adds a bit of layer to her. If we want to put live action over everything, her portrayal in Andor is fantastic. I think season 2 will also be incredible. We also get Genevieve O'Reilly in Rogue One, and we also have Mon Mothma as a huge part of Rebels. I've got to go with canon Mon Mothma.
Canon Mon Mothma all the way. Genevieve O'Reilly smashes it. I don't think she has the best story in Andor season 1, but she has like a very sad and personal, disturbing one. Next up, we have Nien Nunb. Supposedly, he also dies on the Tantive, but he's also like one of those characters I don't really care too much about. I don't really know him much about Legends, but I know there's not much.
Legends for so long was just subject to the original trilogy, right? And so there were so many random background characters that are given huge backstories. And surprisingly, Nien Nunb is not one of them. I will give it to the canon version, even if it purely because he's on Rise of the Resistance. He'll be immortalized forever there. So moving on to Padme. Padme is a character who I think has gotten a lot more service in canon as well. We've really tried to dive into the females of our big three in the both prequel trilogy and the original trilogy in canon. And Padme's gotten her own trilogy of novels, which is a big help. She's also in Brotherhood, and then she is in season 7 of Clone Wars, which has some emotional moments between her and Anakin right before the Revenge of the Sith, which are important. Legends, though, she is in a lot of novels and Legends, and she does have a lot of like that Phantom Menace timeline development. I'd give it to the canon version. I think we've taken this character a bit more seriously in canon than we have in Legends, and I think for that reason and future storylines that we're definitely going to give her in canon, I'd give it to canon Padme.
I also go with Canon Padme. I think a lot of Queen's Hope, like that book really fleshes out her handmaiden situation. And that is like one of the biggest personal questions I've ever had. Like, how does this work? Why is this in place? The fact that the deleted scenes with her and Mon Mothma and Bail Organa are basically treated as canon now makes me quite happy because she is going against her husband, but for the right things in that movie. Our next character is Palpatine, Sheev Palpatine in canon. I want to say canon just because he's back in Rise of Skywalker. You can't discount Plagueis. That is a pretty big part of who he is, and that book is wonderful. I don't love Dark Empire. I really don't like how it's handled there. I think we got our better version of Dark Empire, which isn't by much, but it's still better as a movie. I have to give it to canon.
Again, to reiterate what you said, post Return of the Jedi and Legends, I think he's a significantly worse character. I think there's a lot more to the Final Order and the Sith Eternal in canon that is a lot more interesting and can be built up to be fixed, I guess, a lot better than our initial legend stories like Dark Empire. Although I am still a fan of Dark Empire 1. When we get stories about Imperial Remnant stuff and we're like, yeah, Palpatine actually set this up, or Palpatine this. So there's a lot of like Palpatine did stuff, I guess, while he was alive, but we never actually get to see him do it. It's a lot of referencing to what Palpatine did in Legends versus canon. We starting to get to see his build up. But I think if I had to take one thing over the other, his backstory in Darth Plagueis is miles ahead of what I think of him in Rise of Skywalker. So I think I would go with Legends Palpatine just for that reason.
Okay, well, I will give it to you.
Next up is Quinlan Vos. Quinlan Vos is another tough one because he's basically two different mediums if we're looking at canon versus legend specific material. In canon, he has a really wonderful book based on deleted episodes of the Clone Wars or unfinished arcs of the Clone Wars. In Legends, he has a lot more story, but it's across comics in the Republic line during the Clone Wars. So I think he's given a lot more depth and a lot more interesting backstory and lore to his character in Legends. In canon, though, it is his relationship with Ventress that really plays him up and makes him a really strong character. I think I have to go with the Legends version of Quinlan, though.
Yeah, I have to go with Quinlan in Legends as well. I think a big reason is, yes, in the Republic comics, that is where he becomes like this dark side acolyte and the struggles to come in and out of that. Dark Disciple would have been an 8 episode arc, split into 2 for the Clone Wars, which would have been really cool to explore between like a Crystal Crisis and Bad Batch and whatnot. That would have been really awesome to see on TV. But I do appreciate it being a book because we got to get a little bit more into the intimate, darker stuff behind his character. A lot of that is indebted to his portrayal in those 2003 era Clone Wars comics. So I think there's just enough there in the comics form to edge him out for Legends over canon. Next up, we have Captain Rex. I have to go with canon. I really love his portrayal in Rebels. Having him be that guy to bring back the Clone Wars, even more so than Ahsoka. Just his stuff in the Bad Batch is so cool too. I really appreciate what he's becoming there. I have to give it to canon. I don't think I really care too much about the comics or whatnot.
I agree. Rex is way better in canon because of Rebels and because of Siege of Mandalore. That's one of the most important arcs for his story. It is nice to get into his head a bit in Legends when we read the comics or when we read some of the novels that he's in, but none of it compares to his appearances in canon, especially post Revenge of the Sith. Next is another easy one, I believe. Rukh, who is Thrawn's bodyguard in both the Thrawn trilogy as well as in Star Wars Rebels. I think the Star Wars Rebels portrayal of Rukh is very good, and I actually enjoy it quite a bit. But again, he's very one-dimensional. He is a villain the entire time, where in Legends, he is the one that kills Thrawn. He takes Thrawn by surprise, and the Nogri subjugation by the Empire is one of the big plots that carries through the entirety of the trilogy. I've got to go with Rukh in Legends. I think he's a more well-rounded character.
Definitely agree. Rukh and Legends, the end of the story there is very much cooler as well. Yeah, I liked him in Rebels, and the fact that he's dead, right, is also like, okay, that's weird. Next up, we have Tarkin, and Tarkin is a very interesting character because I think he has a huge effect on Legends. You know, a lot of proteges, involvements in a lot of different projects that fall under his doctrine, but we don't necessarily get Tarkin. Like he is a player in Legends, he is a character in Legends. But in canon, we have Tarkin. That book is such a deep dive into his early life that I really enjoyed. And a lot of his childhood in Ariadu and a lot of the hunts and the challenges that he had to go through, the physicality is a huge part of his mental sharpness that I really appreciated. I can't say I really know anything about him in Legends. That is where one of my biggest weaknesses is on this list. But just for what I got in canon, I'm pretty comfortable saying go with that version.
I think canon easily for Tarkin. Tarkin, a lot of his development in Legends is obviously pre A New Hope, so it doesn't give us as much time to work with, but we do get more stuff with him around the early prequel trilogy timeline. But in canon, he's been one of the characters that since the start we've really dived into. Tarkin, I think, was a book that it's a great, great deep dive into the character. He is a huge part of Catalyst and one of my favorite parts of that. And then a massive appearance in Rogue One, something we were not expecting when that movie came out. And
Yeah.
I think he's wonderful in Rogue One. It's also great in Rebels. We're getting him in the Bad Batch. There's so much more story to Tarkin and canon. Got to give it to the canon version of Tarkin. Next is Thrawn, the one you've probably been waiting this whole list to see. Thrawn is one of the hardest ones on here. I know we've said that a lot, but Thrawn truly is one of the hardest characters to rank. Believe it or not, he has had probably more and more impactful and in-depth appearances in canon than he has in Legends. But again, when you go back to the Thrawn trilogy, it did start Star Wars multimedia, really, for all intents and purposes. It is the reason we're still talking about Star Wars books today. It's an incredible book, and he's a wonderful villain. Depends which version of Thrawn you want more. I think Thrawn is more relatable, and you get under his skin a bit more in canon. He is a bit more of an anti-hero, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with him in live action. We also get him in Rebels. And Legends, though, he is the most iconic villain besides Vader and Palpatine. He is just maniacally perfect in the way he's able to craft his plans and create battle strategies, and he's almost too flawless at times. I think I got to go with Legends Thrawn though, just because of the iconicism. But really, I do love Canon Thrawn. I've read everything Canon Thrawn, and I love his appearance in Rebels. I think here in the future, though, Canon Thrawn might actually pass Legends Thrawn.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like Canon Legends Thrawn is probably one of the characters that I actually just both put on the empty row. Like everything that we've gotten so much more, I'd say, of Thrawn now. I mean, we've gotten Ascendancy, we've gotten a loose 3 books of Thrawn set around the Rebels era, and then a lot of his early backstory in the Empire has been in Legends, but here it's truly fleshed out in canon. But then there are things like the impact of on Star Wars history. We don't talk about Star Wars without him and his Legends version. Outbound Flight is one of the most underrated Star Wars books out there, and it really fleshes out what he's doing in the prequel era and before. He might be more complex in canon, but he's way more iconic in Legends. I have to give it to Legends Thrawn. Next up is the biggest bad of all Star Wars, and that is Darth Vader. I don't know. He's had so much content in Legends and canon, and we are just looking at Vader as himself, not anything as Anakin. But the level of quality consistently throughout canon for him and the way that every version of Vader stands on its own. I mean, the best early Vader story has to be that Charles Soule line. It's so good. So at the end of the day, even if there is more quantity for Vader in Legends, the amount that we've gone so far in canon is just impeccable. So got to go with canon Vader.
I have to too. I think since day one, the Disney has made Vader like the face of canon multimedia. 3 comic book series. He's appeared in so many other ones, multiple miniseries, and not just to mention his appearances in Rebels as well as the end of Clone Wars season 7 and in Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like Vader is just everywhere. Rogue One, I have to give it to Canon Vader. As many cool things as Legends have given us towards Vader, and again, another character that because a lot of our stories in the 90s were written post Return of the Jedi, there's a lot of things that Vader did posthumously that we learn about, like in mentions and like legacy for Vader, but we don't get to see him as much. Most of his legacy pre 90s era comes in like Splinter of the Mind's Eye or the Marvel Comics. In
Yeah.
canon, a lot of these stories are a lot more impactful. They hit at the core of who he is. They're not just like cool stories, or a lot of times Legends would use him as an ancillary character to be like this badass along with another character who absorbs the badassery of Vader. We get to get under his helmet in canon a lot. Next is Valance. Valance is a character who has been brought from the Marvel comics of the 70s and 80s into canon. I got to give it to the canon version. The canon version is a protagonist, and we get a lot more emotion to this version than we do in the Legends version, where he is more of a straight villain.
I'd give it the canon version too. I am regularly reading Bounty Hunters, and also he's an Han Solo Imperial Cadet. Like, he was with Han. He was a guy who came from a poor mining planet, and wanted to do everything he could for the Empire before his body started getting ravaged and destroyed. And Han also saved him there too. So there's that dynamic that has been played into the Bounty Hunters line and War of the Bounty Hunters. Next up, we have Ventress. She has an extremely iconic introduction in 2003 Clone Wars. That fight with Anakin is really iconic, but then we can't include Dark Disciple, unfortunately, because that's one of her best stories, and that's in canon. And I think her treatment overall in canon has been a bit better. I mean, I love Dooku Jedi Lost too. That's a great story as well, and that also hints at a lot of like the stuff that we see in 2003 Clone Wars and their initial meeting and all that being played out exactly the same.
Canon Ventress definitely has more character to her, I think, with just purely Dooku Jedi Lost and Dark Disciple. Dark Disciple provides a nice sense of closure to her entire arc throughout the Clone Wars 2008 series, and the Dooku Jedi Lost provides us a nice beginning point for her story. We also have her appearance in Brotherhood, where she is one of the bigger characters in that, but I do love her appearance in Clone Wars 2003. She's very cool, and I think ultimately cooler, but I think because of the story aspects, because of how strong of a character she is, and it's nice to get an actual wrap up for her story in Clone Wars, and Dark Disciple. I've got to also give it to the canon version. Next is Wedge. Wedge, I think, is very easy to decide. It's Legends all the way. He's the main character of the X-Wing books. He's a character that plays throughout almost the entirety of all the New Republic stories. In canon, he does have a surprisingly large amount of material. He is one of the main characters of the Aftermath books, and he is in Resistance Reborn. None of that compares to anything from the X-Wing books, where he is the main character, and the X-Wing comics, all of that. He's so great in Legends.
Yeah, I like that his introduction in canon, his origins are maybe a little more in focus with Rebels and his appearances there. I do like that. It is truly just Legends Wedge that clears. I know I love him being a little cameo in the Millennium Falcon and Rise of Skywalker, but he's not a character. He's just a cameo there. Next up, we have Zuckuss, and Zuckuss, I think, is a very fun character in canon. I think he's very comedic in a way, and he's fun. I think he's fun. I think he's one of those bounty hunters that has a unique ability, which lets him become one of the best. But he's also filled with personality, and I really appreciate that. I've been always enjoying his humorous moments in the canon comic book series, so I have to go with him in canon.
I would too. I think he's a lot more endearing in canon than he is in Legends, where he's more menacing in Legends, and he might have a larger backstory. He has like multiple personality disorder and stuff in Legends as well, some schizophrenia. He's very endearing and fun in the Bounty Hunters line. It's one of my favorite parts of a line that never really goes beyond surface level excitement. And I think Zuckuss is one of those characters that I definitely look forward to reading there. So finally, we end off on my favorite Star Wars character of all time, Obi-Wan Kenobi. This is another tough one because I do really appreciate Obi-Wan's appearance in 2003 Clone Wars. I think it adds a lot to the General Kenobi part of his life. He's very cool. His fight with Dirge, all of that is really awesome. But he is more stern and, again, a lot closer to the Attack of the Clones version of Obi-Wan than the Revenge of the Sith version of Obi-Wan, even all the way through that entire series. Like, he's very hard on Anakin. There's a lot more coldness to the relationship, and we never really get to see that explored further. In Legends, we also have a lot more literary material with him between the excellent Kenobi book. Obi-Wan is like the main character, one of the main characters in almost all of the big junior novel series, with Jedi Apprentice, Jedi Quest, and The Last of the Jedi. So it is hard with the quantity of stories, especially pre-Revenge of the Sith in Legends, and I do want a lot more of that in canon. But when we get to canon, we did have Ewan McGregor return for Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is really hard to top. We also got a great appearance in Rebels, as well as his duel with Maul, which I think is a seminal moment for Obi-Wan. Brotherhood is another great book that adds a lot of layers to Obi-Wan's life. It's tough because of the amount of stories in Legends, but I think the characterization of Obi-Wan overall, I've enjoyed more in canon.
I would agree. I think to your point of the coldness of Obi-Wan, that it feels like something that is like an artifact of Attack of the Clones. And I don't know. I really did love Ewan's performance in Obi-Wan Kenobi. His dynamic with Leia and having her name her son after him. Yeah, I love his fight in Rebels. Very samurai-esque. It's beautiful. I know I agree with your point that there's so many stories, like junior novel stories. I mean, Jedi Apprentice, loved reading that as a kid. And once I was kind of getting out of the junior novel era, get into a good bit of Last of the Jedi, and I really liked a lot of stuff there. It's more of like the transition point from Attack the Clones to Revenge of the Sith, and partly the transition between the Phantom Menace to early Attack of the Clone stories that I don't think people always land. Brotherhood, I think, makes so much more of a stride for Obi-Wan being more accepting and loving of Anakin as a brother and happy for him canon all the way.
All right. Well, thank you so much for watching our tier list. Let us know what you think down below. Obviously, our opinions are all going to differ greatly. Like the video if you haven't subscribed to the channel. Make sure you're checking out our Bad Batch coverage. It is coming out every single Wednesday and Friday. We also stream Jedi Fallen Order every single Friday. So if you haven't been tuning into those streams, we answer your questions live. It's a great way to interact with us directly. Thank you so much for watching this tier list, and we'll see you all next time.